Thank you, Bila. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. My name is Rahmi Hertanti. I'm from Transnational Institute. I'll be the host for this webinar together with Bila. We will help and guide you all with the technicalities of the webinar. So this webinar is co-organized by Indonesian Coalitions for Economic Justice, focus on the global South, FTA Watch Thailand, Third World Network, Transnational Institute, the Australian Fair Trade Investment Network, and Canadian Center for Policy Alternative. So we aim to have series of webinar on trade investment agreement nexus ISDS climate issue by connecting the trade justice movement and climate justice movement in Asia Pacific, advancing a just transition agenda. The rising trend of geopolitics around green transition has pushed the escalations of trade and investment agreements to secure market access, both on renewable energy project and critical minerals for energy transitions. And these agreements become a tool for multinational corporations seeking protections, especially from the investor to state dispute settlement or ISDS. Now we can see many FTA negotiations are happening in ASEAN, including bilateral agreements in its ASEAN member states itself. And therefore, these webinars, the series of webinar, will become the collective platform, the Trade Justice and Climate Justice Group, to foster knowledge and exchange around the issue of climate and energy transitions, nexus trade and investment agreement. So this is the first part of the webinar series, and hopefully we can organize another topic soon. This webinar will be moderated by Joseph Puruganan from Focus on the Global South, based in Manila, Philippines. So I would like to invite Joseph Puruganan to start our webinar. So now it's your, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Rakmi. Thanks to everyone for joining this webinar on the proposed ASEAN-Canada FTA. Good morning to our friends joining from Canada, and good evening for those joining from Southeast Asia. These negotiations are happening at a very challenging time, globally and regionally as well for ASEAN. Chaos, conflicts, tensions, uncertainties, shifting alliances, fragmentation, these are just some of the ways to describe the current state of global affairs. There are serious questions as well on whether free trade agreements are still relevant or are still significant. Or as one Canadian economist asked, are they even worth the paper they are printed on? ASEAN's top diplomats who just met recently in Kuala Lumpur and economic managers described the challenge of, quote, finding synergy to respond to the growing economic security nexus and navigate an increasingly complex and fragmented landscape, unquote. This fragmented landscape is underpinned as well by what has been described as great power rivalries, mainly between the United States and China. Everything from access and control over energy and critical minerals to the global race over artificial intelligence, who gets to determine the direction and speed of digital transformation and the implications of these on strategic, economic, and security objectives. All of these are tied to these power dynamics. ASEAN and Canada are both in the middle of these tensions. And the challenge for both lies in advancing their own strategic interests as they navigate the landscape. Of course, power asymmetries become a factor in all of these. The power between and among countries, as well as the power imbalances and conflicting interests, say between corporations and communities, and the role that states play. ASEAN states, for example, have reacted to Trump's unilateral tariffs, choosing to capitulate and negotiate from a position of weakness rather than leverage. Will they have the same stance when negotiating with countries like Canada, or will they take a stronger stance? Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, are important sources of critical minerals that are sought after by many countries, the US, Canada, the EU. Allow me to quote some figures from the Global Critical Minerals Outlook 2025 report to underscore the significance of critical minerals in the current context. Demand for key energy minerals continued to grow strongly in 2024. Lithium demand rose by nearly 30%. Demand for nickel, cobalt, graphite, and rare earths increased by 6 to 8% in 2024. This growth was largely driven by energy applications such as electric vehicles, battery storage, renewables, and grid networks. Despite this rapid demand growth, major supply increases led by China, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo exerted downward pressure on prices, especially for battery materials. Third, the critical minerals world has moved further towards concentration rather than diversification, particularly in refining and processing. And then last point from the report, between 2020 and 2024, growth in refined material production was heavily concentrated among the leading suppliers. As a result, the geographic concentration of refining has increased across nearly all critical minerals, particularly for nickel and cobalt. The average market share of the top 3 refining nations of key energy minerals rose from around 82% in 2020 to 86% in 2024, as some 90% of supply growth came from the top single supplier alone, Indonesia for nickel and China for cobalt, graphite, and rare earths. China's stronghold extends beyond refining. 2/3 of global battery recycling capacity growth since 2020 has been in China. It is in this concentration of resources and refining and dependence on China that has many big powers worried. And so diversification, as the report highlights, is the watchword of energy security. Canada views critical minerals as the, quote, building blocks for the green and digital economy. Its own critical mineral strategy combines upstream, geosciences and exploration and mineral extraction, midstream, intermediate processing and advanced manufacturing, and downstream, assembly and end use and recycling. There's an increased emphasis, particularly in the global north, including in Canada, on the energy transition. It is interesting to discuss what role is ascribed by the global north to the global south in this energy transition. Who in the end will carry the greater burden? Will countries that produce raw materials that are essential in the production of environmental goods serve as sacrifice zones, bearing the brunt of environmental, social, and human rights impacts? Another issue that exacerbates this imbalance is the asymmetry in law that favors the interests of corporations over people. The provision, for example, on investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, would allow Canadian mining companies to sue ASEAN states over public policies to regulate these investments. At the 11th session of the Intergovernmental Working Group negotiating a legally binding instrument to regulate TNCs, ISDS became a point of contention in the discussion of the primacy of human rights over trade and investment agreements. There's a lot to discuss and unpack. We are fortunate that tonight we have friends who can help us do this, to clarify the issues and make sense of the complex context so that trade justice, climate and environmental justice campaigners can strengthen our efforts to push back these trade agreements and push our alternatives. Let me introduce our speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak, and we will give them 15 minutes each to make their presentations. Our first speaker is Kyla Tienhara from the Queen's University, Kingston. Dr. Kyla Tienhara is a Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment and an Associate Professor in the School of Environmental Studies and the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University, Kingston. Her research focuses on environmental policy and governance, the energy transition, and international investment law. She is an internationally recognized expert on the environmental and climate policy impacts of international investment arbitration. She has been invited to speak on the topic in forums such as the OECD and European Parliament. Her work on investment law has been published as a book with Cambridge University Press and in prestigious journals such as Science, Climate Policy, and Global Environmental Politics. She is currently based in Adelaide, Australia, during her sabbatical year. The next speaker is Stuart True. Stuart is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he directs the center's trade and investment research project. The TIRP network brings together more than 100 researchers from universities, NGOs, and the labor movement to understand the impacts of trade and investment treaties on public policy, human rights, the environment, and democracy. Stuart has been writing about and advocating for trade justice for 2 decades and holds a master's degree in political economy from the Carleton University. And then last but not least is Karina Yong from Third World Network in Malaysia. Karina is a senior researcher with TWN, where she specializes the impact of investment and trade agreements on human rights and environmental and other laws and policies in developing and least developed countries. This includes analyzing the implications of multilateral agreements, UN treaties and conventions, investment treaties, and the investment chapters of free trade agreements on human rights, such as the right to health, the right to food, indigenous rights, and responsible business conduct. So those are our 3 excellent speakers. Let me give the floor now to Kyla to start us off. Kyla, please, you have the floor.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I was a bit distracted during it because there was a fire alarm going off in my building, but thankfully it stopped. I was very concerned that I was going to mess up this webinar, but hopefully we can now proceed without any more interruptions on my part. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this incredibly important topic of how investor-state dispute settlement impacts just energy transitions. I'm going to start with some basics. I'm not going to assume that everybody here, spends as much time thinking about ISDS as I do. So in short, investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, is the enforcement mechanism for over 2,600 international investment treaties that are currently in force around the world. Most of these are bilateral investment treaties, or BITs for short. Those are signed between 2 states, usually one from the global north and one from the global south. For example, the agreement between Canada and Thailand is a BIT, although Canada tends to call these Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreements, or FIPAs, but it's the same thing. And then there are also bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements that have a chapter on investment that acts in the same way as a BIT. For example, the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. And then we also have the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, which I always like to note is neither comprehensive nor progressive. But and then there's also the agreement that we're sort of focused on today, which is the proposed ASEAN and Canada agreement. So what all of these agreements do is provide protection for investors from one party when investing in the other party. One question you might have is, why do governments sign these agreements? Well, obviously, global north governments are trying to provide protection for their companies when they're investing abroad. But what about in the global south? Well, for a long time, countries in the global south were sold the idea by the World Bank and others that signing an investment treaty would help them to attract investment, which would then, in theory, boost economic development. However, it is important to note at the outset that there is no strong evidence that signing an investment treaty leads to greater flows of investment. In other words, there is no public benefit associated with these treaties. There are, however, substantial costs associated with these treaties. So to understand these costs, you need to know a bit more about how the treaties are enforced, which is through ISDS. And as you can see from these charts from UNCTAD, we have now had over 1,400 ISDS cases, most of them in the last 15 years, and most of them brought by investors from the global north against governments in the global south. So what is ISDS? Let's take a hypothetical situation. An investor, let's say a Canadian mining company, is in your country and wants to have an open pit mine in an environmentally sensitive area. But there's a lot of community opposition to the mine. Maybe there's even a court case against it. And eventually the government says, we can't approve the permit that the company needs to proceed with this mine. The mining company is, of course, not going to be happy about this. They could go and challenge the decision in the local courts, but maybe they don't think that they have a very good chance of winning there. But good news for the mining company, Canada has an investment treaty with your country, so now they can completely bypass the local justice system and instead just go to ISDS, which is a form of arbitration. And instead of the case being heard by a judge with knowledge of the laws of your country, the case is going to be heard by a panel of 3 arbitrators. And one of those arbitrators is going to be handpicked by the investor. The decisions of those arbitrators are not going to be based on the local laws of your country, but instead in some very vague provisions that are in the investment treaty. Why should you be worried about this? Well, there are a lot of problems that have been identified with this whole process. First, the arbitrators are mostly male and from the global north, and they are trained in commercial law, not environmental law, not human rights law. There are also serious conflicts of interest that can arise because individuals that act as arbitrators in one case can also act as a lawyer for an investor in another case. This is referred to as double hatting. It's something that would never be allowed in a domestic court system. There are also issues with lack of transparency in the process. Proceedings are in most cases not open to the public, and documents are not always published. There are also very limited opportunities for third parties, such as environmental organizations or local communities, to intervene or participate in the proceedings in any way. The cost of the proceedings, which can drag on for many years, are pretty astounding. So 5 million US is the last average sort of that I've seen, but we've seen cases where governments have spent more in the range of 10 to 20 million or more. And then another issue is that if an award is made against a government, there are very limited options to challenge it. There's no appeals process, as there is, for example, in the trade regime, or there used to be. And as a result, there is a lot of inconsistency in awards in how treaties are interpreted. That in turn makes it very difficult for a government to feel confident that they're going to be successful in their defense of legitimate public policies. And that means that when they're faced with the threat of an ISDS case, some governments may back down and let a company proceed with their plans, even if that is not in the public interest. So that's referred to as a regulatory chill. And that idea makes even more sense when you consider what happens if a government loses a case. So the standard award in ISDS cases is monetary compensation. But tribunals don't just provide compensation for what an investor had already spent on an investment, for example, on exploring for minerals or for oil, but also on lost future profits. That's the hypothetical money that the investor could have made over the duration of 20 or 30 years of mining or extracting oil, for example. And this is why we see the awards climbing into the hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. And for many countries in the global south that are already dealing with debt crises, this can be crippling. So this is obviously bad, but how is it specifically relevant to just energy transitions? Well, because as has been helpfully pointed out by the law firm Freshfields, disputes flourish in times of transition. And we have definitely seen over the past few years a substantial increase in ISDS cases related to the energy transition. So we can start by looking at the transition away from fossil fuels. Some governments are banning new fossil fuel extraction projects, or these projects are getting knocked back in the courts. On the left-hand side here, I have photos from 2 examples of this type of scenario leading to an ISDS case. So first we have the Rockhopper case. Here, the Italian government banned offshore oil developments along the coastline, and a British company with an exploration license launched a case under the Energy Charter Treaty, or ECT, and won over 250 million euros in damages. I would like to highlight that this award was nearly 7 times what the company had actually invested in the project. It was a windfall. Second, here we have a very recent case where a local community was successful in challenging a coal mine in the courts of the United Kingdom, and after the approval for the mine was revoked, the company turned to ISDS. Now, both of these are examples from the global north, but there are also many examples in the global south, such as the case that Glencore brought against Colombia after a high court suspended the expansion of a coal mine. And if we look now at the map on the right-hand side of this slide, which is from a paper that I wrote with colleagues a few years ago, you can see that a lot of the risk for future ISDS disputes around oil and gas deposits which are shown in the darker regions in these maps, a lot of this risk is in the global south. We have a very similar story with infrastructure. For example, coal power plants, which need to be phased out by 2040 if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. A lot of coal plants in countries in the global south, like Indonesia and Vietnam, are very young. Why is having young plants a particular problem? Well, because if you force them to retire in the next 15 years, they're going to lose a lot of value. And when there are foreign investors involved, they are going to demand compensation for that lost value. And if the government doesn't offer enough compensation, they're going to go to ISDS to try to get more, or they're going to at least threaten to do so. This chart shows the countries with the most treaty-protected coal plants that would lose significant value if phased out in a Paris-aligned pathway. This is somewhat out of date now. It's from the 2020 report that I co-authored with Lorenzo Cotullo at the IAED, but I think it still gives you a good sense of where the risk lies. And a lot of it is in the ASEAN region. We also have existing cases that we can point to here. Even though in the global north, we don't tend to have as many young coal plants, we still have at least 5 ISDS cases that have been launched with compensation claims in hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars, 2 against the Netherlands, 1 against Canada, 1 against Germany, and 1 against Australia. If anyone has questions about these cases, we can go into them in the Q&A. Moving on, because time is short, the other side of the transition going into the renewable energy economy. So I'm sure we are all aware, we've already heard a lot of discussion about it to start off this webinar, that the energy transition requires critical minerals, and a lot of those critical minerals are in the global south. Now, in these countries, some governments are making moves to try to capture more value of the critical minerals by either nationalizing ownership or banning export of unprocessed minerals, or changing other terms in order to try to have their countries benefit from these resources, and they are being threatened with ISDS cases as a result. Equally important to consider is that local communities that are impacted by mining projects often aren't properly consulted about them, aren't benefiting from them. If they protest and take their concerns to the government or to the local courts, and if they are eventually listened to and the project is stopped, then what do you think is going to happen? The companies are going to launch ISDS cases. So these graphs are again from a recent UNCTAD report, and they show the substantial increase in critical mineral disputes, including 51 ISDS cases so far that are about critical minerals needed for the energy transition. I think Stuart is going to talk about critical minerals in more depth, so I'll leave that there for now. Finally, let's just talk a bit about renewable energy infrastructure. Here we can again look at some existing cases to see some trends. First, we have quite a few countries that have implemented incentive schemes to try to attract renewable energy to their jurisdiction. But for one reason or another, they've had to modify those schemes and have subsequently been taken to ISDS by investors. Those investors are arguing that they had a right to a certain return on their investment, and that the one that they expected under the initial scheme. And so even if they're still making profits, they will turn to ISDS because they want a higher level of profits. Spain has been hit by 51 cases, 51, over the changes that they made to their feed-in tariff scheme. Some people argue that this kind of case demonstrates that ISDS is important for the green transition because renewable energy companies are using the system. There are a lot of holes that we can poke into that argument, but the main thing I want to stress right now is that governments need flexibility to experiment with policies to facilitate the energy transition. They won't always get things perfect immediately, but ISDS is essentially putting policymakers in a straitjacket. It's not allowing them the flexibility that they need. Another very recent example is from Honduras, where an authoritarian regime had signed some very unfavorable contracts with solar investors, which the current democratic government has tried to renegotiate, and this has led to disputes. Again, this is about distributive justice. Should the people of Honduras have to pay exorbitant rates for their energy just because a corrupt government signs some bad deals? Finally, again, I think it's important to stress that all of this risk created by ISDS in the renewable sector is not balanced out by any benefits. There is no real evidence to suggest that agreeing to ISDS in an investment treaty will help your country to attract renewable energy investment. So my conclusions are probably not going to come as much of a surprise. I think that ISDS will lead to an unjust transition because it will shift costs of the energy transition from the private sector to the public sector and from the global north to the global south. This is counter to distributive justice. At the same time, it will be excluding local communities and their rights, which is counter to procedural and recognitional justice. But I do want to end on a positive note, so let me share this with you. There are many wonderful examples of activism against ISDS actually working. One example is from Europe, where activists worked for years to highlight the problems with the Energy Charter Treaty, or ECT, which is the largest and most utilized investment treaty in the world, and they won. The EU and many European countries, as well as the UK, have withdrawn from that treaty. There are other examples in Australia, New Zealand, Ecuador, and importantly, in the context of the agreement that we are focused on today, Canada and the US removed ISDS from their trade agreement. And when that happened, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs said, ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest, to protect public health and the environment. So if that is how the Canadian government feels about ISDS, you should ask yourself, why are they pushing it on ASEAN countries? Thank you very much. And please do reach out if you don't get your questions answered during the Q&A. I'm happy to receive any by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyla, for giving us an important update on ISDS. I thought before your update that because it was considered a toxic element previously, that somehow that agenda has died off, no? But it's alive, it's still being pushed, and as you said, especially in this time of transition, no? But and thank you also for ending on that note. I think that we can go back later on when we discuss how then do we push back and move the campaigns forward. So thanks again for that, Kyla. Now I give the floor to Stuart to further unpack and maybe give examples of on ISDS and how potential ISDS provisions under the ASEAN-Canada FTA. Stuart, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph, and thanks, Kyla, for that very good presentation. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know when it pops up, and there we go. So how do you start the slide again? You go to slideshow and play from start. How's that look? Looks okay. Okay, good. So thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this important webinar. It is very timely with everyone in the ASEAN region right now, right? Everyone in quote unquote Western countries. Our prime ministers there looking for deals, looking for critical minerals deals. Let's be frank as well, and looking for some fossil fuel money as well. A lot of the problems we talk about, and I'll get to this in a second, with respect to ISDS. And the problems it creates for democratic decision making around resource development, around the environmental protections we want to put in place. A lot of those are visited upon Canada as well through these ISDS mechanisms, as Kyla and many others have talked about. We talked about at the CCPA. And I partly wonder if that's one of the reasons that we sign these treaties, is there are elements within our government as well who understand and appreciate the disciplinary effect that these treaties have on the Canadian government and on provinces, perhaps, that would want to regulate developments here in this country as well on a more responsible way. So anyway, I'll start with that. I'll also say quickly that the title here is an inside joke, maybe for me alone, because situation critical is a fairly cliched statement. You see it in movies and stuff, but it's also a song from a Canadian glam rock band from the 80s called Platinum Blonde. And platinum being a critical mineral, I thought that was pretty apropos that I give it this title here. Look it up. It's a really, really cheesy video if you can from the 1980s, but a pretty good song. So let's go. So the points I'd like to make, just four simple points. These are going to be very obvious, I think, for a lot of people on this call, on this webinar, because we work on these issues. We work on mining, we work on environmental protection. So the point simply I want to make is that these cases, as Kyla said, cases of investor-state dispute settlement related to quote-unquote critical minerals are increasing, and a lot of them involve Canadian firms. I'll show you a slide later. Something like 30% or more of these cases actually involve Canadian mining companies, so it's quite significant. Obviously, mineral extraction and refining is highly polluting and socially disruptive. Whatever the critical value of these goods, it's not clear that these goods actually are necessary to dig out. It is maybe economical to get more of this stuff on the market, but there are obviously alternatives like recycling, like not producing as much, that are undermined by this big global push for digging up more things. China paid a very high price, right, for gaining dominance in these sectors. It paid a high social and environmental price. It's very dirty work. The third point is that ISDS, as Kyla was saying, creates liabilities for governments, and it chills efforts to regulate mining, but not just to regulate for the environmental protections, right? To make sure that these things are being done responsibly, but also to try and do things like industrial strategy, right? That would maximize the value you're getting as a country for, as Joseph was saying, for the cost, right? For the cost of getting this out of the ground, if you want to bring it up the value chain. ISDS, I think, frustrates those efforts as well. And finally, just to point out, and I believe Karina will be talking about this as well, that the Canadian interests in the ASEAN deal, that they do extend beyond ISDS. And we should point out that Canada does have treaties with a lot of ASEAN members already, through the CPTPP and through investment in individual bilateral investment treaties. But there are other elements of this ASEAN Free Trade Agreement that will frustrate decision-making and democratic decision-making in ASEAN countries. And some of it relates to our Prime Minister in terms of wealth management firms, certain wealth management firms that he used to very recently run as president. So what is critical about these minerals? I think, Joseph, you gave a really excellent overview, so I'm not going to go into detail here. This is the big play right now. It does to some extent come down to geoeconomics, strategic rivalries between the West and China. These fears, whether or not they're real or not, or overblown around China, freezing countries out of their access to certain critical minerals. They're critical because they're required in these quote unquote technologies of the future, right? From windmills to renewable energy and batteries and so on and so forth. The technology changes all the time, right? It's possible we won't need as much cobalt, because battery technology does change. And we might not even need nickel in batteries of the future. Who knows? But the point is, we do now, and they are important for getting a critical edge over in competition between firms in these sectors. They're critical also because if you look on the chart there from The Economist on the left, death metals. That's a funny pun, in line with the music reference I made at the top, I guess. But they're important for the army as well, for building shells, bombs, guided missiles, jet fighters, and so on and so forth. Like they're critical in that sense, I think, very importantly for the United States. And I put the data center chart here as well, because obviously there's a lot of wiring and other metals that go into this big AI push, right? Bubble, this artificial intelligence bubble, let's face it. There's so much money going into this thing, and this is probably a webinar for a different day, but that the chances that this AI bubble is going to blow up a huge portion of the the global economy at some point, maybe in the near future, is pretty high. It's kind of worrying, but they do use a lot of stuff. They use a lot of energy. And if they want to do it in a clean way, that's a lot of renewable energy. So that does suggest, as Joseph was saying, that some of the increased demand that they are talking about in terms of copper and in terms of other wiring is real, that they really need that much stuff to build out the data centers to the extent that they want to. This is just more of the same, as Joseph pointing out what Joseph was saying, that there is the issue is that there's a lot of that China has a grip on the manufacturing and production of a lot of these minerals. So that's what makes them critical. The points I want to make really focus on Canadian mining, right? So this idea that Canadian mining companies are going to be a real benefit to ASEAN countries, because they have the expertise and the know-how, and they can come in and they can help you realize your potential as powerhouses of resource development and as upgrading and refining and so on and so forth. This is just, kind of a brand thing. It's kind of a propaganda thing on the Canadian part. Obviously, like any mining, Canadian mining is not particularly clean. The quotes here are from a Mining Watch report from October 2020. It just shows that even in Canada, mining generates 30 times the volume. I'm just going to hide this a second. I can't see my screen. 30 times the volume of, I can't read that. Hang on, sorry, 2 seconds here. There we go. Okay. Yeah, mining generates over 30 times the volumes of solid waste of all citizens, municipalities, and industries combined, right, on a yearly basis. As the grades of the ore and the deposits that are mined get lower and lower over time, more waste is generated. Mine waste sites are also failing at an increasing rate. And there's a picture there this is one of Canada's biggest natural mining disasters. It happened in 2014. A tailings pond spill. Basically, the dam just breached, and massive flood of toxic materials into the environment. This happens at Canadian mining sites around the world. In Brazil, we saw some recent cases as well. So they're not particularly any more reliable than any other kind of company would be in these respects. Dozens of mine waste sites will require wastewater treatment for the next 200 to 400 years. So this is a near-term rush to get these minerals out of the ground. But in terms of how do you deal with the toxic waste that's produced, essentially they just leach, the dirt full of chemicals until they get what they want out of it, and then they leave aside, what they don't need, which is massive amounts of waste. And you've got to look after that waste in the same way as you look after nuclear waste. In fact, a lot of the soil is contaminated with uranium and can be quite hazardous in that way as well. So just to say, you're not going to get anything better from a Canadian mining firm than you would from your own or from any other countries. The Canada brand, that's a report that came out from Osgoode Hall Law School in December 2017. That's the title of the report. It pretty much talks about what is the human rights record of Canadian mining companies abroad, and it's not good, right? So, frequent cases of killings, injuries, sexual assault by mining security and local police. I put some examples down there and the names of the companies involved. We don't have to go into this in too much detail, but the point is that Canadian companies have been involved in all of these kinds of things. Forced evictions in Tanzania, for example, at the Barrick gold mine. A lot of Canadian interest in gold and copper, right? Both critical minerals, but copper particularly harmful. And there's been a lot of these human rights abuses do happen at Canadian copper mines, for example. Copper and gold frequently go together. Threats to human and environmental rights defenders. We'll see in a second a slide related to Ecuador. In Peru and Mexico as well. We'll talk about the Mexico case in a second. Use of forced labor, right, in mines, and environmental harms, right, the big one that we're talking about today. Obviously, mining is very environmentally risky, and Canadian firms have been involved in some very high-profile disasters and some very high-profile ISDS cases related to countries that simply want to start regulating or maybe stop certain Canadian mines from going ahead because of the threat to water, the threat to indigenous peoples, the threat to animals, and so on and so forth. Maybe more pertinent to our discussion today is that Canadian mining companies are massive users of investor-state dispute settlement. And this is from a report that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives put out in 2022. We frequently update, and we will be again soon, I think next year, a list of cases involving Canadian firms. You can see on the chart on the left that 70% of Canadian ISDS cases come from mining, quarrying, and oil and gas companies, right? And then you can see at the map on the right where the most of those cases occur. So the larger bubbles include more cases. You can see them over Latin America, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, for example. Yeah, and this trend, as we can see, continues, right? So these are recent critical minerals cases, as I was saying earlier. This is from a report from the CCSI, Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, last year. And I kind of went through, they pulled out about 50 or so cases of critical minerals that were current right now or recently concluded. And I pulled out the Canadian cases here, and there's about 20 of them. So about, more than 1/3 of the cases. We won't go into the details of what those cases are. You can see again, largely Canada's interests are in copper, nickel, gold, that kind of thing. There are some rare earths companies in Canada, but it's not that prominent. And in fact, in the ASEAN region, there's not a lot of Canadian investment yet in mines outside of a few countries. But this is what this agreement is intended to do with the investment protections is intended to encourage more Canadian mining companies to seek out opportunities. Case here, a terrible case. Not only do Canadian companies use ISDS a lot, but the federal government here is very supportive in all respects of the industry. And this is what happened in Mexico in the case of Blackfire Exploration. This was a company that bribery was involved in getting a governor to approve the mine over the opposition, massive opposition of the community where it was going to take place. A case where the Canadian embassy knew that this was happening and knew that it was occurring, knew that there was opposition. This man, Mariano Abarca Roblero, who was murdered because of his opposition to this mine, he had visited the Canadian embassy to raise these issues. Basically, through an investigation that happened years later, found out that the government was very involved in helping this company with the applications and eventually encouraging them when the community successfully had the decision overturned, right? The mine was overturned. The government was encouraging the company to use ISDS in the NAFTA as well. And there was no recourse in Canada eventually for no justice for the family of this murdered individual, Mariano Abarca. And it's an example of just the state of level of support there is in Canada, as I was saying, for the industry. This happens all over the place. It happens in Ecuador as well currently, and I'll mention that in a second. Another case, very common case that's used to discuss the problems with arbitrators not considering human rights and other international obligations on states when they decide cases. In this case, the company should never have gotten approval for this mine. There was long-standing opposition to mining from the community in this region, obvious threats to land and biodiversity, company repression, basically against opponents. And eventually the government came into power that reversed the decision to grant the mine. But nonetheless, the ISDS panel ordered Ecuador to compensate the Canadian firm for breaching this fair and equitable treatment of the company and their full protection and security. So, this is a case where the tribunal acknowledged that the company had acted very badly, but nonetheless, its rights had been violated through ISDS. So, at the end, the mine didn't go ahead. I mean, and this is an important point that we need to underline is that ISDS does not increase the chances that you're going to get a mine built as a government, if that's your intention, or a company. It simply complicates everything, and it simply puts the thumb on the scales of justice in the interest of the investor over the community, the affected community. So it's not going to get us anywhere where we want to go in terms of, even if we did want to build out this critical minerals into value added and so on and so forth, ISDS tends to complicate things. Currently in Ecuador, the government is trying to reverse progress that was made on ISDS They're trying to reform the Constitution again so that it would allow the state to pursue new treaties with ISDS and remove things like the rights of nature from the Constitution. And there's been massive repression of freedom of speech in the country, of rights to organize against these projects, these mining projects. There's a new bill that would strip NGOs of their status, of their ability to operate. If they say anything negative about certain mining projects that the government has supported, it's amazing stuff. And from what we can tell, the embassy, the Canadian embassy, is supporting these efforts by the mining companies and the governments to get back to the point where there is investment protections, recourse to ISDS, and so on. So as Kylo was saying, I won't dwell on this. There is a chill that this puts on government policy. I would add that that chill affects Canada as well and is intended to affect Canada. I think the Canadian government would love it if there was reasons not to go as fast as they want to go on more and more LNG exports, but that's a matter of debate. And then finally, that there are these other risks in this ASEAN-Canadian trade and investment treaty. So when we think about mining, it's not just the mine that's involved. There's a number of services that go into getting mines operational, from the power that's required, roads, highways, infrastructure, other things like that. And those are areas where Canada feels it has some kind of competitive edge. And so that's where Canada's interested in this agreement. It's in finance, it's in engineering, it's in electricity. And so even if there isn't a big presence of Canadian mining in the country, in the ASEAN region right now, there is some, but it's not as extensive in other parts of the world. There is a threat of ISDS cases from all of these other areas of capital investment related to those projects. And I put some cases at the bottom of that slide. For example, a Peru highway project involving Brookfield. Brookfield is a big Canadian asset manager, right? They invest in real estate to try and get money, right? I mean, real estate is basically where most money is these days, and things that you can put on top of land, right? So, for example, solar panels. There's an Excelio. Excelio is owned by Brookfield, and they are currently threatening Honduras with an investor state case related to a solar farm that they wanted to put on some land that they had purchased. That was completely opposed by the local community because they simply weren't involved and they weren't going to see any benefits. So this is something to watch out for. And a lot of money in the ASEAN region, Canadian money goes into these sectors through currently financial relationships in Singapore. So the final slide I'll show is where the money is right now. You can see the pink line at the top is Singapore. The other lines down there in the low 5 billion kind of range. But growing, right? It's a growing interest, growing site of interest for Canadian firms, especially in fintech, finance, engineering, and so on and so forth. So options, I'll just end here. Options, if we're talking about what do we do, right, about this ASEAN-Canada free trade talks. We are abolitionists at the CCPA. I think that is the wisest approach, is we don't want investor state dispute settlement in any more treaties, and we want to scale it back wherever we can. There are alternatives, though, if you wanted to, reduce the potential that this is going to affect your ability to responsibly mine and develop critical minerals. You could exclude them from the treaty. And this is something we saw Mexico do to some extent in the new NAFTA agreement, the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. There's a different kind of pared down version of ISDS for oil and resources. So that's something that can be done. We could try and use these negotiations to force Canada to cancel all of its other investment treaties in the region. This is something that's come up in the context when activists were looking at the old Biden administration, U.S. efforts in Latin America, right, to forge America's, I forget what it's called, APEP, Project for Economic Prosperity or something like that. The point, yeah, that's right. The point is you could use these things to basically flip the switch and get a less bad version of whatever this is, ISDS and investment protections, and replace the existing bits. I don't know if that's an option in this case, but anyway, it's one of them. And finally, you could think about strict limits on the awards as a very, low level. This isn't going to fix the problem. You're still going to end up with the cases. All of the regulatory chill still remains a problem. But at the end of the day, if you can avoid paying out future profits, you can really reduce those awards to the low millions or the low tens of millions, perhaps, in terms of sunk costs. So the companies only get back what they put in, literally what they can prove that they put into the project, which would, I think, discourage a lot of companies from going that the ISDS route, because it's simply not that lucrative. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thanks, Stuart. I enjoyed the musical references at the beginning as well. And thanks for bringing into the discussion the Canadian perspective. I think if you relate this to a point made by Kyla earlier, it's important for campaigners to, how then do we leverage, on the one hand, the position of the Canadian government seemingly against ISDS, and on the other hand, what you pointed out, that the Canadian firms, big corporations, actually are big users of the ISDS mechanism. I also appreciate you bringing into the discussion the security and trade nexus. We're seeing a lot of these hybrid agreements, if you may. Of course, there's also the aspect of securitization of supply chains that have also domestic implications, particularly when these investments are deemed as critical infrastructure that that requires or would be protected by security and military forces in countries like the Philippines, for example, where we continue to be dangerous places for environment and indigenous people's rights, no? And so taking note of the HR record of Canadian companies is also very important for our collective campaigns. So thanks for that. If we can maybe share these presentations, and we will find a way to share these, Kyla's and Stuart's presentation, to all the participants, no? But this is a good segue to our next speaker, Karina, to discuss further the threats, not just to human rights, but to climate action as well from ISDS lawsuits. Karina, you have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get my presentation up, please? So while we're waiting, I'll just say this, right? So other than the investment chapter and ISDS clauses, the coverage of the new generation of trade deals is extensive. We know that in the past, developed countries were principally concerned about gaining access for their corporations to other countries through foreign investment. But now what they want is to control the global supply chains and digital platforms through which global capitalism operates. So there's a point I want to make, that here in ASEAN, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste are least developed countries, and they have very important special rights and flexibilities known as special and differential treatment at the WTO. So these provisions aim to accommodate the economic vulnerabilities of these countries and institutional challenges that they face, and these can be removed under trade agreements. Now, we have also seen how serious the impacts of ISDS provisions are. However, the overriding principle, and I want to restate this, for all countries, as clearly stated in various human rights instruments, and not least the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is that not only governments, but also the corporations that these governments protect, must respect, protect, and fulfill our fundamental rights, such as the rights to health, to food, to clean environment, in the cause of trade, and not just in the home states, but also extraterritorially, meaning in other countries that they operate in as well. So when you give the investor the right to sue government, you are putting profits before public interest, before the fulfillment of human rights and needs. Now, on the first slide, I just want to mention that for the Canada-ASEAN negotiations, they began in 2021. 2 days ago, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that the targeted date for completion would be 2026. Now, the importance of ASEAN to Canada is that ASEAN is Canada's 4th largest merchandise trading partner. And of course, there's great pressure right now on ASEAN communities and countries as other countries compete for our natural resources, whether in the form of critical minerals, genetic resources, and from there, digital sequence information, and also our data. The global north also compete for our markets for their goods and services. Collectively, ASEAN has the 3rd largest population in the world after China and India. For the Canadian-ASEAN agreement, significant opportunities identified by Canadians and Canadian businesses in ASEAN include in agriculture and agri-food, fish and seafood, natural resources, manufacturing and financial services. On its website, Canada has clearly stated the intention to include ISDS in its investment chapter. So now, apart from ISDS, as Stuart said, I will touch a bit on the other clauses within the trade deal that can impact our communities and our countries. So apart from ISDS, there are other provisions that can have impacts on the environment and climate action. For example, the goods chapter can undermine GMO regulation. Under clauses on products of modern biotechnology, for example, ASEAN's biosafety standards can be undermined, and thereby our right to reject unapproved genetically modified organisms, GMOs, as the agreement can set weaker requirements than those established under international instruments, such as the Cartagena Protocol on Biodiversity and the Codex Alimentarius Commission's Food Safety Guidelines. So we could be pressured to accept contaminated shipments without prior risk assessment, eroding zero-tolerance GMO policy and subjecting our decisions to trade dispute mechanisms that favor exporters and investors, ultimately risking public health, environmental safety, and regulatory sovereignty. In the services chapter provisions can limit policy space to favor domestic environmentally friendly suppliers or to require environmental performance standards. These could environmental performance standards could trigger trade disputes. If these new environmental regulations are perceived as trade barriers or as treating foreign providers less favorably, even where public interest justifies such measures, and technical qualification and licensing rules can be disciplined, meaning it will constrain how governments can regulate. For example, in subjects like land zoning, water quality, construction standards, mining, discharges, fishing licenses, and more, all relevant to environmental protection. And the good regulatory practices chapter, under the guise of harmonizing regulation and increasing transparency with lengthy stakeholder consultations, corporations can influence or delay rulemaking. So processes can become more costly and the implementation of the precautionary principle becomes more difficult. So this chapter also increases pressure to repeal or water down existing safeguards if they are deemed trade restrictive or not aligned with international best practices. So now we go to the next slide, the environmental exception. Now this environmental exception usually does not apply to the investment chapter. And the environment exception is often copied from the WTO, where it's so difficult to use that governments have only succeeded in using it twice out of 48 attempts. And even where it does apply, I will show you later through the eco-oral case, which is a concrete example under ISDS of how ineffective the environmental exception can really be. So any chapter on trade and sustainable development is unlikely to override all these chapters that are problematic for the environment. So if ISDS is agreed upon in the ASEAN-Canada FTA, and ASEAN is sued and loses on ISDS and doesn't pay the investor the award, then Canada is likely to be able to enforce it via tariffs on the ASEAN countries' exports until it pays. All right, so as Stuart mentioned just now, in terms of ISDS actions have been taken on state measures implementing climate and environmental measures. For example, refusing to grant oil and gas exploration permits, the phasing out of coal-fired power plants, denying permits for large mines, introducing fracking bans, and strengthening laws to protect water supplies have all been the result of arbitration claims. The number of known ISDS cases targeting actions taken by states to protect the environment has more than doubled each 10 years, right? So from 12 initiated prior to 2000 to 37 in the period of 2000 to 2010, and from 2011 to 2021, it became 126 cases. Now this is, can we go to the ASEAN dataset, please? Next slide. Next one. Yeah, so this is actually an overview of ASEAN cases up to December 2023, taken from UNCTAD's dataset. So it basically shows the number of cases that have been taken against ASEAN countries, with Vietnam in the lead with 11 cases, Philippines 8, and Indonesia 7. over a myriad factors, but of course mining is in there as well. So next slide. Next one. I will now go into examples of some cases, yeah? And I selected these cases to illustrate some points and to show you a selection of the fights within this region as well. When the environment, so the examples show how the environment exception can be negated when the award is so huge that it compounds economic instability in the country, when the investment itself is tainted with illegality and the state wins, but then what? And lastly, how export controls in our country can trigger ISDS claims. Now, a word on export controls. Export controls, we all know, are measures that are taken to restrict or control by way of licensing. For example, exports of certain commodities out of your country. So in ASEAN, Indonesia has export controls on nickel. Malaysia has export bans on rare earths, right? And there are several strategic reasons why you want to use export controls on critical minerals. Promoting domestic value addition by restricting the export of unprocessed or raw materials, developing countries can encourage the growth of domestic processing and manufacturing industries. Export restrictions can stimulate local industries by providing downstream sectors with lower cost inputs and opportunities for learning, along the way building local technological capacity. So similarly, policies that favor local processing, creating jobs in engineering, skilled trades, and advanced manufacturing, over time, this can lead to technological upgrading and knowledge transfer, and we reduce dependency on commodity exports. All right, so now we go into the Eco-Oro case, right? So this is shockingly important because it shows concretely the arbitration tribunal disregarding the environment exception, which our governments always cite as being sufficient to carve out the protection of our policy space. So the Canadian mining company Eco-Oro entered into a contract with a Colombian state entity that gave it exploration rights and also a right to exploit the gold deposits that it finds there, on condition that the company succeeded in obtaining regulatory approval such as an environmental license, which is normal, right? So the concession area overlapped with Páramo de Santurban, a high altitude wetland that played an essential role in water cycle and served as a carbon sink. But the exact overlapping area was contested. So it took a period of almost 7 years for them to then decide that there was a 50% overlap. Now, this then set into chain a sequence of events, right, that gave rise to the case. So in I'll just go down. So the FTA in question, the Colombian-Canada FTA, contained the usual exceptions clause, all right, found in many investment treaties and agreements worldwide. Now, there's a typographical error here. So the exceptions clause stated that nothing in the FTA's investment chapter shall be construed. It's correct. Nothing in the exceptions clause stated that nothing in the FTA's investment chapter shall be construed to prevent a party from adopting or enforcing measures necessary to protect the environment, provided that such measures do not amount to arbitrary discrimination of a disguised restraint on trade or investment. So in granting the award, the ISDS tribunal in the Eco-Oro Colombian case found that even if the environmental exception applied, so Colombia was actually not in breach of the investment agreement, right? Colombia was still required to compensate the investor, but in this case, there was no award of damages because they could not prove the loss, right? So, but what it essentially meant was that the environment exception allows environmental measures which meet all the criteria, but compensation still has to be paid to the investor for measures which are covered by that exception, right? Rendering the exception ineffective. So even when exceptions exist for health, environment, or public welfare, tribunals may still prioritize investor rights over domestic policy goals. Now the case of, next please. Next. Sorry, thank you. The case of Battalion Copper is infamous for its USD 5.8 billion award against Pakistan. This was actually 25 times its original investment. And it was during the time when Pakistan was undergoing economic crisis as well and had just received an IMF loan of 6 billion. So this award compounded the situation in Pakistan, increased economic instability, and resulted in its draining of public funds to private investors. Next, please. In the Churchill mining case against Indonesia, we are looking at what happens when the investment is tainted by illegality, in this case, corruption, bribery, forgery, or fraud, right? So Indonesia revoked the mining lease because there was forgery. in the documents that giving permission to mine, right? So what happened was, despite the fact that Indonesia won, of course it had to pay its legal fees, which was about in the region of 12 million. They were thankfully awarded 75% of those costs because the tribunal took into account that Indonesia's administrative procedures were somewhat outdated and could have been better, right? But the point here is that even when you win a case, right, the costs that are incurred in defending the case can be substantial. Now, the last one, Newmont case, next please. The Newmont case against Indonesia is concerning export controls. So this one was a case that arose out of the introduction of export restrictions on copper, which is something that Canada is interested in, right? Including an export duty and a ban on the export of copper concentrate, which allegedly stopped production at the Batu Hijau copper and gold mine. In the end, Newmont withdrew its case from ICSID, but not before the government gave the mining company special exemption from national policies. So the negotiation process was far from transparent and the deal could not be monitored by local civil society organizations. The bid expired in 2015 and Indonesia did not review. However, the investment treaty contained a so-called survival or sunset clause whereby investments originating from before the treaty's official termination date of 1st July 2015 will continue to have full treaty protection for another 15 years up till July 1st, 2013. So, next slide, please. Next. Hi. Okay, thanks. So we just want to look at, so what are the positions of governments on ISDS in this region, right? So one of the most notable examples is RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership Agreement, whereby Malaysia's Trade Minister in 2021 said all countries involved had agreed to exclude ISDS provisions from RCEP. This stance protects our right to regulate in matters of national interest without threat of large arbitration claims. The chapter will remain untouched. There is hope that India may sign at a later date, right? But RCEP entered into force in 2022. And then there is a clause in Article 10.18 that says that within 2 years of its entry into force, meaning by 2024, countries will have to consider whether to include ISDS or not. So what then happened, next slide please, is that recently civil society groups sent an open letter to the governments involved in RCEP. To giving reasons why ISDS should be kept out of the RCEP. And the reasons are as follows: because ISDS undermines public interest regulation and hampers climate change action, and costly claims damage national finances, no compelling evidence that ISDS increases foreign direct investment, and consolidates power of corporations. More countries are resisting ISDS. ASEAN countries need policy space. Now, the other agreement that countries in this region are also part of is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Next slide, please. Out of the ASEAN countries, 4 countries, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Singapore, are members of the CPTPP, together with Canada, Australia, Chile, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, and the United Kingdom, right? So there is ISDS and the CPTPP, but countries have actually signed side letters, like for example, with Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, which limits certain the application of the ISDS provisions, right? In this region and in the Asian region, several other countries have taken action. Like, for example, India has notified termination for 58 plus bids since 2016. Indonesia began terminating its 67 bids in 2014. Pakistan, since 2021, Pakistan has resolved to terminate at least 23 of its 48 ratified bids that have completed their initial duration and will not ratify another 16 signed. Vietnam is participating actively in UNCITRAL Working Group 3 and submitting written comments on ISDS reform to improve procedures. So last but not least, like Stuart said, no to ISDS in the ASEAN-Canada trade agreement. What I have here is actually the statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations. Hang on a second, I can't see. Yeah. So the UN Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, right? Basically said that As you can see, the ISDS system has especially devastating consequences for the Global South, perpetuating extractivism and economic colonialism. The overwhelming majority of fossil fuel, sorry, I'm having a problem seeing my screen. The overwhelming majority of fossil fuel and mining ISDS claims are brought by investors from the global north against respondent states in the global south. In fact, the majority of fossil fuel and mining ISDS claims filed between 1995 and 2021 were brought by investors from just 5 states: Australia, Canada, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States. So it recommends that that developing countries eliminate their exposure to future ISDS claims through some combination of the following actions, right? Which includes the removal of ISDS mechanisms from all existing investment agreements and in future agreements. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Karina, for giving us a critical reading of the provisions and how we strengthen our counter arguments to government's arguments and claims, and also bringing into the discussion the specific cases, emblematic of how unjust ISDS system is. So we had very, very good, very substantive presentations from our 3 speakers. So we thank them again for sharing their insights and their expertise with us.